All right, so thickness planer. Thickness planer is the second half of the smoothing, flattening machines. A jointer's job is to make a surface flat. The other half of this is to make a board the same thickness everywhere. So if we have a flat reference side, then we want to end up with the other side parallel. I don't want to run both sides through the thickness or through the jointer, because the jointer can put two flat edges on something but not be parallel to each other. So I do a flat side with the jointer, put that flat side down on the bed of the thickness planer, and then the thickness planer will cut the top to match. Thickness planer has to have a piece of wood at least 12 inches long. And the reason for that is inside the machine there's a rear feed wheel and a front feed wheel and the cutter head in between, very similar to the jointer, where it has 3 blades in it. If the board is not long enough to get from the front feed wheel to the back feed wheel, it'll bounce around inside the machine, getting chewed up by the blade and eventually just disappear up the dust collector. So you need to be long enough to get from the front to the back, so we say a foot to be safe. When I'm using a thickness planer, I want to make sure that I don't allow myself to become stuck between an immovable object and the board coming out. And I want to make sure my fingers are going to be clear when I'm putting it in. The most common injury I see with a thickness planer is people putting the board in and then the board snapping down and they pinch their finger against the edge of the table under the board. You do want to make sure you never look through the throat of the machine while it's running, so I never want to look in this opening, as that'll be the time when some little loose knot or a chip will come and touch the blade and bounce out of the machine. So I never want to have the machine running and look through it at the same time. When I set up the machine, I want to set it to the thickness that the board is currently. So we have a scale on the front of it. I want to set the board to whatever the scale is. So in this case, I have 22 millimeters, but I'm going to check several places. 23, 23, back to 22. So I want to check the board several places to make sure that there isn't a hump or unevenness in the thickness of the wood. Now that I know that, I can set the machine to be the thickness of the board. I never start at what I want the final cut to be. I always start at what the board currently is. And then I work down to the final measurement that I want. Parts of the planer. Bed. This is the feed. Disengaged. Engaged. Throat. Measurement scale. Power feed or power height adjustment. Manual height adjustment. On-off switch. As always, with any machine, we make sure we have our 3 P's. Permission, eye protection, personal protection. This is one of the machines that I want to be aware of getting caught on material. I don't want to have a piece of cloth get caught and pulled into the machine, as it can pull me in with it. So I want to make sure everything is tucked in, there's nothing loose on the front, and as usual, if I can't get everything tied back, then I'll use an apron to put over front to tie it all back. Make sure your stepping area is clear as you're going to be feeding material into the machine, and make sure that you have space behind. As usual, if you need to have help with a longer board, either get a helper or a roller stand for your outfeed. So I'm going to set the machine to the 23 millimeters. I can do this with a manual height adjust. It's quicker and easier. So we need to set it with the power feed. Down moves the table down, making a thicker cut. Up moves the table up, making a thinner cut. So I have it set for 23 millimeters to the top of the arrow. I would rather a cut that takes nothing off for the first pass than take too much off in the first try. Come up 2 millimeters. Once I've done that, the thickness planer should have made this perfectly even thickness all the way down the length of the board and along the width. If I started with a flat jointed side, this will now give me a parallel board. This means that these two sides should now be even and parallel. This should be a square edge off the jointer. So now I have 3 flat sides and 2 square corners. That takes us through most of the 10-step process. Now it's just a case of going and flattening out the edges.